Thank you so much. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Leslie. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for coming out. I wanted to say that this is Giant Night. This talk is a bricolage, a non-linear bricolage, and a performance of sorts. And I have an assortment of texts of my own, from others, some poems, some documents, texts that have been in books that have gone out of print, and other meandering, some of my mother's letters from 1966 that seem relevant, and some quotations and musings. And I'm currently trying to work on, I don't want to use the word memoir. I have a problem with that word. I'm afraid it's too popular, and also I'm not sure I could cover everything that you're supposed to. But I do love this. I'm influenced a little bit by, maybe some of you know Shen Fu's book, which is called the Six Records of a Floating Life. So I'm working on something called episodes, I don't know how many episodes, of a floating life, something like that. So I've been, getting little snippets from here and there. I sort of shuffled them before I was doing this John Cage chance operation, and we'll just see where it goes. The book I was referring to, the Shen Fu, was written in 1809, and it's a gentleman with various life issues. It's a document of love, of history, of social concerns, and what life was like in China in 1809. So we're going to go back a little bit to the founding years of the Poetry Project, but also some precursory poems and thoughts about that, and then a kind of little bit of my story of coming to the project. I actually got involved at the St. Mark's Arts Projects before the official the money came in from the Office of Economic Opportunity under Lyndon Johnson. You can imagine they were giving money to alienated youth on the Lower East Side, and that was in 1966. No, I can't even imagine anything like that at this point. But so we're going, that's kind of the frame I'm working around, sort of and I invite you all. How many people have been to the St. Mark's Church? Oh, wonderful. They actually have a new sort of you can do the self-tour where there's a brochure of the different historical things in the church. Maybe some of you experience that or come to events. Yes? Come to artistic events? Okay, great. I was hoping we could have a tour tonight, a candlelight tour over there. The images you see are a range of things. I'll just quickly go down this list. They're not dated or the provenance and so on, and they come from a number of books. I want to thank Erica Hodges, my assistant, for helping get those together. I've just given her a list of names. It does not include everyone that should be up there. There simply wasn't time to research all that, but yeah, some text. But we started with Joel Oppenheimer, Paul Blackburn, Vladimir Mayakovsky, Lorca. It'll be a guessing game. See if you can figure out who they are. Rimbaud, Lorraine Niedecker, Hilda Doolittle, Langston Hughes, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Gertrude Stein, the atom bomb, Black Mountain College, a couple of photos from there, the Berkeley Poetry Conference, Mehdi Baraka and Diane DePrima, Frank O'Hara, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Charles Olson, Barbara Guest, Robert Duncan, Ed Sanders, hippie posters, shots of the village, both East Village and, in fact, when we started the project, it wasn't even the East Village at that point. It was the Lower East Side. Shots of the village, the Nuyorican Cafe, St. Mark's Church, Poetry Project poster. There's some other images of the project. There's a picture of me with the bishop, the Episcopalian bishop, who came down to sprinkle some water when we had a special tree planting ceremony for poets. And then with a number of friends, with Louis Warsh, an early partner, Joe Brainerd's in there, Jim Carroll, Patti Smith, Lou Reed, Sam Shepard, John Wieners, Tom Weatherly, Rochelle Owens, Carol Berger, Diane Wachowski, and then some images from different books. Also Alice Notley, Eileen Miles, Bernadette Mayer, Umbra Collective, The Living Theater is referenced, Robert Creeley, Joanne Kiger, John Ashbery, more photos with friends, the St. Mark's Fire, which was very terrifying, and some I guess, early sort of manuscripts of projective verse, and then covers from books, Cross Worlds, Out of This World, Giant Night, Nice to See You, an Angel Hair Anthology. So just to create a little bit of an atmosphere. That was a very special reading because Charles Reznikoff had been in hiding. Nobody had heard him read or seen his work, was not in print, and we were able to track him down and bring him out of his retirement to give an extraordinary reading. Giant Night, the title comes from an early poem of mine. I'll just read a few of the lines. Awake in a giant night is where I am. There is a river where my soul, hungry as a horse, drinks beside me. An hour of immense possibility flies by, and I do nothing but sit in the present, which keeps changing moment to moment. How can I tell you my mind is a blanket? It is an amazing story you won't believe, and a beautiful land where something is always doing in the barns, especially in autumn, sliding down the hayrick. By March, the sun is lingering and the land turns wet. Brooks grow loud, the eddies fill with green scum. Crocuses lift their heads to say hello. Soon it is good to be planting. By then the woods are overflowing with dogwood, redbud, hickory, red and white oaks, hazelnut bushes, violets, jacks in the pulpits, skunk cabbages, pawpaws and May apples, whose names thrill you because you can name them. There are quail and rabbits too, but I go on too long. Like the animal, I must stop by the water's edge to have a drink and think things over. That was good, the drink I mean. I feel refreshed and ready for anything, though I'm not in Vermont or Kentucky, unfortunately, but in New York City, the toughest place in the world. And it's December. Here someone is always weeping, including me, though I tend to cry in monster waves and turn into a fish wallowing in my own salty puddle. Look out, if you aren't wearing boots, you'll be sorry, and soggy too. It's a very early poem. It does go on a little bit longer, but. Okay, this section is off cells. The question of how we are contemporary with our time always intrigues me, fascinates me. It's an urgent question that Giorgio Agamben asks, the Italian philosopher, and others such as Stein, Gertrude Stein, and Ezra Pound have asked before and referred to the notion of the continuous present in the mind of the poet. All times are contemporaneous, and Gertrude Stein's continuous present. And I tend to ask it everywhere I go. There's a way we see light in the darkness of our skulls. My friend, filmmaker Nathaniel Dorsky, talks about the ineffable quality of vision being expressed by projected light within a dark theater, something like that in the mind. And Agamben says, it's the poet's job to look into the darkness of our time, and that is how one becomes contemporary with it, just that inquiry. And when we see that the light has already reached us and is still coming to reach us, we live in that troubled aporia, that space of contradiction, kind of negative capability of space and time. So what to do? Do you just become paralyzed in that moment, or can you step out into public space? And I worked in Indonesia with the program in Bali. There's somebody from Bali here, and there's this sense of the tripartite shrine, the inner temple, the outer, and then the kind of middle temple and the outer temple. In the middle temple, there's a particular figure in one of the dance performances that is in the Chandi Bentar, the doorway, standing like this, very static, and it can go on for 20 minutes, and then that figure steps out and sort of breaks the spell, coming into the public space, coming out to the audience, the spectators, and then beyond that, there's a kind of sense of the marketplace and an exchange going on in the human realm. We certainly seem to be in a sadly broken, dark age, which can be very paralyzing. The overwhelming Anthropocene, everything intervened upon and often destroyed by the hand of man. But there are vision cells that are activated when we actually look into the darkness. They're called off cells. And I think we don't have to be stuck while we have our vibrating larynxes and artistic hands and invoking the sense of poesis, which comes out of this notion of making, we can move into a space of risk and action and poetry and so many other forms and genres with curiosity to be of benefit to others and be with others in the conversation and keep earthing our charge while we still can and tread lightly and cut the ego attachment to image and see our place in the scheme of heaven, earth, man, and try to do no harm as we continue this struggle for the environment, for social change, for other species, for all the non-human elementals, and for the issues that burn our world. And keep creating imaginative zones. These, if they need be, temporary autonomous zones, ideas that, something that Omar was invoking, the sense of an architecture of a vision of how to be in communities, say, that it has to have a space, and you have to create that space and make that space, but there's a image that you have, there's something there, something that's not quite formed that sort of starts to take hold when you think about how to organize that, step into it, organize that, how to create a more generous, enlightened society. Keep creating these zones. Looking into the darkness is like seeing into the cosmic mirror, free from conditioning, from bias, vast open space. Get our minds out there. Don't tarry, don't tarry. And so I feel that we were very contemporary with our time when we started the Poetry Project, when we started using that space. There were many things going on in the 60s in New York, as I'm sure some of you know and have studied and witnessed. And for example, Al Carmine's not too far away from here at the Judson Theater, where terrific dancers were occupying those spaces. Carolee Schneemann did one of her first extraordinary performances there of Meet Joy, which I saw in high school, I think. And there was a sense of these places opening up for artists and for community, and without charging money. I mean, sadly now, of course, the project continues at St. Mark's Church, and the dance space continues there, but the rent is high. So it's a very different thing you have to work with, shifting a sense of responsibility and actually being inside the system, and how to make that work for the continuity, if it can continue. But at that time, we were not particularly self-conscious about what we had to do. I was just 20 years old when I walked into the St. Mark's Church, and there was a lot going on that year before the project officially moved in. Paul Blackburn had moved with the other poets into the parish hall, and there were readings, pretty much somewhat invited, curated readings, but open readings. There's a great document of all of those. It's just been released. I think it's 55 years of Paul Blackburn's, 55 years now since he was making all those tapes, hauling his Wallensack to the Poetry Project and to a lot of the other poetry events around town. It's an extraordinary archive, and it's in San Diego, and they've just sent out a release about how that can be used by scholars and poets, and I'm looking forward. They evidently, I think my very first poetry reading is in there, so that's interesting to not listen to. Just to say something about, without realizing it, it was a terrible time in many ways. The Vietnam War was really hard. There was so much protest. We had our own flatbed truck out of St. Mark's. Sam Abrams sort of oversaw that, driving around with broadcasting anti-war poetry from the truck, and then we had many events, and we had, at one point, we were housing a lot of other organizations and groups in that space, and in those early years it included the Black Panthers Breakfast Kitchen. The Panthers were actually founded in 1966. We had the Motherfuckers, who also had some kind of feeding deal. We had the Trotskyites. I used to go to some of the Trotskyite meetings. They were pretty interesting, a little bit somber. And then there was the Puerto Rican Liberation community, and also working to help a political prisoner, Carlos Feliciano. And so I was on that committee, and then also one served on the vestry. So the vestry was the official church board of directors or organizers or advisors. And that was advisable, you know, to keep everybody in the loop, keep them in the flow, tell them what we were doing, keep the support going. So it was an extraordinarily busy, humming place with a lot of, I think, goals in some way, but the main thing was the conversation and the activism, and then the art. And I don't know if you need to put them in any kind of order, but they were all happening simultaneously. So that was powerful. And it was powerful to feel, and I think that gave me confidence, and in feeling that, you know, the agency one felt toward this kind of work was really, could work. It could work. You could actually create something out of nothing, you know, once you had a space, once you had the space. And likewise, later at Naropa, we started with nothing. We didn't have a building. We didn't have an office. We didn't have a budget. We didn't have a telephone. We didn't have stationery. It's harder now, I know. But we were, you know, it was very timely, I think, that the project could coalesce in '66. This is a text of mine. As I said, I'm working on this kind of episodic floating world. And it's including poems that are ways of following some of the history. So this is called At Mountain. Black Mountain, which when you see people out in a rural environment holding pitchforks and things, we're at Black Mountain. So this is At Mountain. Where is Hitler, 1933, getting started? Austria, murky, compromised place, getting rejected, if not art school, its life perennial. Master, the mastiff, the matador somewhere. Then Mussolini drives the notes down, murder camps to come. Then Mao of hideous remembrance, shortcut to stars. Could you whistle, could you paint, could talk? Mao, he's sort of okay. No, 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 could you whistle, could you paint, could you talk? Surely, very here, 30s, 50s. John Dewey, a praxis, hands-on, where shelter? What sense perception affords you, Ezra Pound? Locked in truce, your body ne'er be ill, served this watch, then bundles of faggots for a fascist enterprise, fascia weak, ancestors in coma, no one a villain, but everyone when you remember the times. What are we up against? Needs, foundation consciousness, how rare you are yet to be born inside PTSD of the father, World War II, girlhood, on the bomb, a wandering, a wand, a great forgetting. Downtown New York and North Carolina, did Franz Klein say that? And Albers, Annie, got through, got out, needs visionaries, all bear witness, voice in wilderness, the sting of it, above humiliation, and welcoming here, oh, come to this Eden, create art Eden, meaning renegades, or up starts the panic, or seed will grow new, get ready for green space. Allowance in discords, mix it up, partners, allies, work duty, camaraderie, lovers on this mountain, already cut a path. Nay could rest, placid, tranquil, ideas but in things, the word, the adequate symbol that you remember, need not war to make it new, so must build inside war machine. Remember you, the great, where is the mind of civilization, not in fogs of war? Where is Jim Crow next door? Where is poetry in rhythms of the legacy and now all the figures of outward? Ed Dorn, born under a dark star. Creeley, when I speak, I speaks. John Wiener's a man who became one with his poetry. And Fee Dawson with Dan Rice, the effect on us of Franz Klein. Youth in the shadows of replacement. Who's what in fact here? Real bodies, real depression, new worlds, magic and witchy lore in rural modernism. Be a mountain of evidence, how brave. Be chronicler of moment, climb and you burst. And the air so high here came before, marched this way feeling lighter than the times. Lighter than the times. So young Dorn would come, and young Creeley, and young Wieners, and Fielding, and Olson, impossible administrator, running a school out of the back of his car, would seem then possible, impossible, but of what to create culture is this. Polis is also this. So polis in the sense of the, again, a kind of architecture. And then this was another piece that came through on thinking about the little magazine. I was trying to get back to being a teenager again. What was my, what was the aspiration there? And, a lot of things, a lot of the history of this more radical poetry was coming through books, coming through very small things like the texts from, say, White Rabbit Press in San Francisco, the magazine, the Berrada and Diane Dupree were doing, The Floating Bear, and so on. So this is teen languishing in Cove, little magazine of poetry, sweet to see, fragrant, flaunts itself. Dress of black taffeta, norm, what cannot see symbol, particles, what is seen but a descent to wandering in pages, binary frames, displacement, teen. Little magazine is lovely to me, made of matchsticks, twigs, vibratory, ashberry, denbee, baraka, put it up all to see. Diane and Barbara. Queen's horses ride into battles, something like that, fancies itself, yet disavows taciturn cruelty, but older now and truly see more clearly ruses of poetry. On other side, valiant suitor for poetry languishes. Magazine is lovely. Narrative voices, girls in temperament, gone icy while await discovery. Nomadic, that too, inimical to me, lovely to read, to see. Of poetry when not a storm, someone blind in it, error of identity, bends it in futurist. This is where one wants to be, tremble on the high snow, or speak of weather, wet clothing on the street, out on the street, people mixing up in it. You love how people meet, pass them on road, long time to be found in the mouth, poet, in the month, more migratory herds than it's spring. Everyone is hungrier. On the ground with your feminist skin, sleek little bear, waiting to be hidden or exposed, a chance in constellation as one must be with bundles of recognition. Little magazine, offing in the stars of cool medicine, of respite, where else you get repose. The poetry knows, the repose that poetry knows. Here, like temperament, passes in a system, ghost, grasses mask urgency. What to name a child of the crossroad? Magazine? Name her poetry, sonnet, ambiguity, personism, projective verse, taboo, female kinetics. People continue reading as animals first appear. Name poetry, let poem fall intentionally so that he sees, he admires, she will steal his fire with her proof of herself's greatest valor. Little magazine of poetry, sweet to me. So I grew up in the shadow of World War II on McDougal Street, shadow of Nazis and the nuclear bomb. My father fought in Germany and at times seemed shell-shocked. He had his work at Pace University. He had gone to school on the GI Bill and then got an instructor job at Pace. And home, he would retreat to his room, blinds drawn, and white noise machines with their low-key, subtle buzz would be on constantly. Growing up in New York, I had friends whose families, in some cases, were camp survivors. There was attendant horror at the exterminations and also the devastation at Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and beyond. How to justify, comprehend, integrate. Did dropping the bomb make us safe, end the war, or did it unleash this myriad-headed monster into our world and psyches? We wore dog tags as children at public school aid and participated in regular air raid drills, taking refuge under our desks and sometimes retreating into the school basement. Some families were building bomb shelters. It made no sense. How would a dog tag be recognizable after a nuclear attack? How would we not be burned to a crisp like the Japanese? Would we be attacked by land or sea? Would the commies land in San Francisco? I cite the luminous detail of the dog tag as a call to be an artist. Being an artist is a way out of cognitive dissonance. So grew up clutching this luminous detail. And then there was, I cite it now as, some kind of intervention or wake-up call. And interest in my own writing has been one of destabilizing war and patriarchy, changing the frequency, as it were, and creating temporary autonomous zones. It's a term from Hakim Bey, TAZ, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, or infrastructures for experimental and activist poetic activity and community. the visionary Moloch section of Hal, Allen Ginsberg's Hal, for my generation was very, riveting, I mean, as many people experience. And that was some of the first poetry I knew, poetry of the Beat literary movement. But that, particularly the visionary Moloch section, written well under the influence of peyote, was particularly gripping in the 1950s and still is. The Canaanite fire god demanding parents sacrifice their children, a propitiatory ritual of auto da fe. Allen was also drawing on William Blake's allegorical figure Urizen with his absolutist satanic mindset. In Blake's myth, Urizen is part of a two-part system up against the laus, or imagination. And Ginsberg writes, the Jehovic hyper-rationalistic, judgmental lawgiver, creator of spiritual disorder and political chaos, his abstract calipers limit the infinite universe to his egoic horizon. So I was drawn to the power of poetry in public space, its incantory power, struck by how Allen later used Vedic Buddhist mantra. Actually, early on, he was in India in the 60s and came back. I mean, it was very unique to think of a poet going to Asia, coming back with mantra to be used in political activism, in public protest and so on. I was drawn to the resistant poetics, to Shelley's view that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the race. I was growing up, as I said, in Greenwich Village, involved in interracial friendships, listening to jazz, had an early interest in Buddhism, expanding one's consciousness with mind-altering entheogens. I was starting to travel to more fellaheen worlds in Kerouac's sense of the word, the sense of what's below the border, the other side of things, the other. An early age, I traveled to Egypt in 1963 by myself, and in the early 70s to South America. I felt part of Gary Snyder's rucksack revolution, and also to a cultural and political activism. I was intrigued by William Burroughs's methodology to the use of dream and montage and subversion of power structures. I was curious about the work of Diane de Prima, who I earlier mentioned, who I met in the early 60s, and Joanne Kiger, who I first met at the Berkeley conference in '65. I was drawn to what I knew of the ethos of the Beat literary movement, and Allen often always asked this question his whole life: what is it you really desire? This was the koan. This was, looking into the darkness of our time. What is it you desire? And then he would sometimes reply to the question himself by quoting William Carlos Williams, and these lines still have a vibratory quality for me. Unworldly love that has no hope of the world and cannot change the world to its delight. You can feel that heartbreak. Unworldly love that has no hope of the world and cannot change the world to its delight. So identifying with that heartbreak, which could also be very generative and kind of open the heart. It opened the heart because everybody's suffering. Moloch, 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 nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of men, Moloch whose mind is pure machinery, Moloch whose blood is running money, Moloch whose fingers are 10 armies, Moloch whose breast is a cannibal dynamo, Moloch whose ear is a smoking tomb, Moloch whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, Moloch whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovah's, Moloch whose factories dream and choke in the fog, Moloch whose smokestacks and antenna crown the cities, Moloch whose love is endless oil and stone, Moloch whose soul is electricity and banks, Moloch whose poverty is the specter of genius, Moloch whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen, Moloch whose name is the mind. And that poem, and that, how many people had read Hal when they were young? Yeah, okay. So also through the wonderful occasion of the Don Allen anthology, which many poets cite as a kind of doorway into more experimental practices and more outrider practices. And just to say, the outrider is not an outsider, the outsider is riding parallel to the going culture, and it is very awake in what else is going on. So I was also charmed, seduced, profoundly moved by the cadences and beauties of the poetry of Frank O'Hara, the Whitman-esque candor, deceptively insouciant, elegiac power of a poem like The Day Lady Died for Billie Holiday, as well as this great long poem in memory of my feelings. Here was someone walking around my city, noting its shimmering details, the ordinary magic of an astute perception with a powerful, emotional, no-fuss trajectory. And the day lady died, just a few lines. And for Mike, I stroll into the Park Lane liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega, and then I go back to where I came from, to 6th Avenue and the tobacconist in the Ziegfeld Theater, and casually ask for a carton of Gauloises and a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it. And I'm sweating a lot by now and thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5-spot while she whispered a song across the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. I used to go to the 5-spot in high school, actually. A friend, David Amram, a musician friend, was very close to various beat writers and part of the movie Pull My Daisy. There's more to read here, Why I'm Not a Painter, but also there was Ashbery. So 1962, a book called The Tennis Court Oath comes out, and these are really riveting poems for their erasure, their montage, their juxtaposition, a kind of complexity similar to, a more surrealist kind of dream, ellipsis, and other modes. I think erasure in this case. There's stories about the creation of the poems in the Tennis Court Oath, working with some found texts and so on, and mixing always the mundane with the profound. So poems such as America and Europe, which destabilize the first-person confessional I, and it sort of, it's a kind of precursor to future experimental and language poetry strategies. The pear tree, moving me, I am around and in my sigh, the gift of the stars, the person, horror, the morsels of his choice, rebuke to me, I in the apartment, the pebble, we in the bed, the roof, rain, pills found among moss. That's from America. And then there was the comic Daffy Duck in Hollywood, something strange is creeping across me. The rubric affinity was the New American Poetry, it's this book. It was so important in its various branches and beyonds, the Beat Generation and beyond, New York School and beyond. And I've been most associated sort of historically with the second generation New York School and the Beats primarily, and helping found these programs that actually had a lot of those characters in there. In the case of St. Mark's, it was the metro scene coming in, and then this second generation, whole younger generation coming in with this more playful side. But I felt an affinity with poetries and poets all over the world through many common grounds. And the impulse also with working with infrastructure, poetic infrastructure, is to have a greater reach, to be able to communicate beyond the borders. So, I was schooled in various things, Yeats, Romantics, student of, various poets in college, but I almost had to forget it when I landed back in New York. But things like, Pound's Cafe were very, very important. And then there were books in my home library. Friendship, camaraderie, artistic collaboration, resistance, sometimes outright belligerence to the establishment, creating economics of gift culture and the like up against the literary mafias of New York and elsewhere, and big-time publishing and media coverage and review. Mutual support, collaboration as well. When Philip Whalen, a poet long associated with the Beats, who was based in California, had gone to college with Gary Snyder and Lou Welch, his long-awaited book on Bear's Head came out at the price of $17.50, which was outrageous at that time. And we mounted this huge protest. We went to our artist friend George Schneeman. We painted signs, 1750 sucks. He's elegant. George's, a lot of his art comes out of living in Italy many years and, being close to Siena. So you have this amazing, beautiful Italian landscapes at 1750 sucks. And actually, it ended with some arrests. The bomb squad came on their motorcycles. This was over a book, an overcharged book. And we did, so a couple of people had to do, explain themselves and go to the courthouse, Bill Berkson, I think, and one other poet. And then the price, when it came out in paper, it was, I think, under $3. So I saw that as an early victory. Tropes, New York School tropes. Let me see if I can find that. I might wait on that. And then another, important figure for the Beats was Berrada, Mary Berrada, who went through, a kind of beat period, and and then when Malcolm X died, I mean, probably many of you know the history, went up to Harlem and worked up there, and then finally went back to Newark and was getting involved with the theater projects and doing plays and workshops of all kinds, but never really, he was close to O'Hara, he was close to Ginsberg, he never broke those connections. And Frank actually said that at one point, I think before he died, that he never stopped being there. And he was also, Amiri was very close to Ed Dorn. And then Amiri was back in the, the larger rhizome, and a very familiar figure coming to read at the Poetry Project and also for years at Naropa. So very interesting, and I think those, the history is coming more to the fore. There's a book of Ginsberg's lectures, which I recommend, that he incubated at Naropa and then later went to Brooklyn College, and so they're from the transcripts from Brooklyn, but he talks about the incredible debt to Black culture and to the writing, the music, the whole sense of the other, the fellaheen, and incredible debt there, and that needs to be explored even more. But I wanted to intervene with In Memory of Radio. Who has ever stopped to think of the divinity of Lamont Cranston? Only Jack Kerouac that I know of, and me. The rest of you probably had on WCBS and Kate Smith or something equally unattractive. What can I say? It is better to have loved and lost than to put linoleum in your living rooms. Am I a sage or something? Mandrake's hypnotic gesture of the week. Remember, I do not have the healing power of Oral Roberts. I cannot, like F.J. Sheen, tell you how to get saved and rich. I cannot even order you to the gas chamber satori like Hitler or Gaudy Knight. And love is an evil word. Turn it backwards, see what I mean? An evil word. And besides, who understands it? I certainly wouldn't like to go out on that kind of limb. Saturday mornings, we listened to the Red Lantern and his undersea folk. At 11, let's pretend, and we did. And I, the poet, still do. Thank God. What was it he used to say after the transformations when he was safe and invisible and the unbelievers couldn't throw stones? Hey, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. Oh, yes, he does. Oh, yes, he does. An evil word it is, this love. Oh gosh, there's so much to cover. This is my mother in 1966. So I'm going to a school where, Gertrude Stein is too silly to teach, and you can't even talk about Ezra Pound because of his anti-Semitism. I mean, there's no sense of, I believe any poet has to get through the cantos. That's the test. And if you can't do that, forget it. So anyway, I'm at a school where they're banning Ezra Pound. Gertrude Stein is silly, but there's some very good Blake teachers and other things. But this is my mother in June 1966. So this is before the project starts in the fall and before Frank O'Hara dies in July of 66. And that was seen as a real marker for a kind of energy coming into the community. And I'd only met him twice. And the first time I met him, it was at a Berkson party, and he burst in the room with the painter Larry Rivers, and I wrote a poem that night called Metabolic Brothers. Forget that. But I was introduced, and he said, oh, come and work I was still in school, come and work at the Museum of Modern Art. And I thought, oh my God, Frank O'Hara's giving me a job. And I was looking for a job, and then it was a volunteer job, so I couldn't do it. But how stupid, I should have gotten somebody, a patron, let me work with Frank O'Hara at the museum, and then he was shortly died after that. So there was a lineage of workshops at the New School that many of the poets of my generation, including Bernadette Mayer, Hannah Wiener, Peter Sheldall, and others took. It was, Bill Berkson was teaching. He had dropped out of college. You didn't need a degree to teach. You didn't need a BA. You didn't need an MA. You didn't need a PhD. And Bill was so brilliant and a terrific teacher. So some people had experienced these, Lewis Warsh had taken a class with Kenneth Koch, and Kenneth Koch was the great poetry teacher, and he was based up at Columbia when I first met him. So this is my mother, who's in a class at the New School. Dearest Annie, Bill Berkson asked me last night to congratulate you on the angel hair and said he hoped you'd be coming to his classes sometime. Peter Sheldall thanked me. And Peter is a poet, but also an art critic who maybe some of you know his work. Thanked me for sending to him and said, it's a beautiful magazine. Well, this session of poetry is over, and it's definitely been worth it for me every minute. Apart from enjoying the pure exercise of intelligence, I've learned more about how to place poetry with some supporting background for my own judgments, which previously were almost totally instinctual, though happily I found out that I was never too far off the mark. It's introduced me to a lot of areas of literature I never paid attention to the French poets, the surrealists, Joyce, though that wasn't real introduction, but a stimulus, and it's been lively fun. The effects on my own writing have been all good, too. I've gotten away from a lot that was unnecessary and extraneous and gotten glimpses of many interesting possibilities for myself. Bill Berkson said he likes my new things very much. He read one of them for discussion last night, Dependency. The discussion for the whole evening was general, more or less taking the opportunity to touch on or ask about anything anyone might feel hadn't yet been covered. Bernadette Mayer had done a sestina called the Aeschyleans, which he also read. It's very Greek in all its conceptions. Her images and concepts are almost completely true to some of my opinions about ancient Greece. Turbulent Stone was one of the best. It's going to be published in Ted Berrigan's C magazine. I think Sheldall's in love with her. Lewis also asked me about that on account of his dedication of a poem to her in the newest Mother magazine. He got very defensive about her poem when anyone criticized even a small thing about it. Bill Berkson, for instance, thought some of the lines too slow, and I objected to a phrase, sainted warriors, and to her use of the word grace in a Christian sense. But she told me after class that she thought I was right and added that her whole idea had come from reading Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. A nice girl. She never opens her mouth in class, though probably an introvert. Bill Berkson spoke of a lot of the similarities between Ashbery and Auden, somewhat similar life circumstances, not much in their poetry of the self as in self-indulgence. Their art is static, even dead in the sense that it has reached its height, it is finished, perfect. I gather he prefers this category of poetry himself. He likes Ginsberg, but finds that some of his things are spoiled for him by Ginsberg's obsessions with his own experiences, emotions, his own person. Ashbery and Auden are more civilized in both a pejorative and a complimentary sense. Some discussion of Whitman, whose rolling, rhetorical, rhythmical, poetic speech was the first and perhaps only American contribution to the poetic art. Obvious influence on Williams, who used it with restraint, and on Ginsberg, who I guess uses it without restraint. Bill wound up by saying that there seem to be two kinds of people who really enjoy poetry. Those who find emotional indulgence in it and it reinforces their own emotions. It's so true. For the other sort, it is entertainment in the best sense of taking you into itself, of an impersonal nature, like religious contemplation of objects, so that what you are left with is not your own emotions, not the feeling of commiserating with others or having them commiserate with you. He didn't say what you are left with, but it seems clear enough that the difference is like that between, say, classicism and romanticism in general, though that isn't quite right because they overlap, and classicism has the connotation of rigidity, and that's not what he meant. You think about it. As a final thought for the week, he threw out, to say that one can't take what seems to be cerebral in poetry may mean that one can't take the higher intellectual pursuits. A gentlemanly way of saying those people are just not bright enough. So, meanwhile, I'm trying to finish college, and these letters are coming. It's like a correspondence course with Bill Berkson, the New School, and they're heady. And Bill was, turning them on to great stuff. The letters are filled with references to different poems, and I recommend the Book of Letters at some point. Okay, bullet points. This was a little side. Running off the world in angel hair, books on the Mimeo machine late at night. We'd be trapped in the workspace in the offices. They were wired with the Pinkerton security agency, so that if you tripped the wire as you were trying to delicately leave, they would show up. And I did that, it was like 4 a.m. And, I walked out the door and there was a guy with a gun, like, at my head. So I was happy they were on the job. There have been a lot of thefts of our equipment, our Selectric typewriters, and there were a lot of grave robberies going on. It was a difficult time in New York. This was later 70s, sometime in the 70s. and actual grave, people thinking there was gold in those tombs. And that led to a certain realignment of the tombstones were all flattened down and kind of, so interesting, looking into the darkness of your time and how it, how you work with all that. And then the church was very open. I mean, it fed people, it helped house people. It was a sanctuary, true sanctuary. Then there's, I'll refer to the assassination of Kenneth Koch later. All night at our apartment, I lived at 33 St. Mark's Place, right near here, staying up all night doing collaborations. We tried to do our own work, Louis and I, who lived there. We were the main occupants, although there were often many other people, after everyone went home, and nights when we didn't answer the door. So we had to be very disciplined. Because every time there was a reading at the church, we always came back to the apartment. And Ted Berrigan had his special ring, so we'd always allow Ted in. He was like, sort of a mentor, always stimulating. The conversation was always great. We could dissect everybody's latest poem. So the parties every Wednesday night after the readings, we had a connection with the factory, with the Andy Warhol crowd through the poet Gerard Malanga and others, and the wonderful poet and artist, and what do you call René Ricard? There's a special word. What? Bon vivant, René Ricard. And then there was one night when the Velvet Underground came to our apartment to listen to their new album. That was a thrill. And a great connection with the extraordinary poet and dance critic Edwin Demby. Maybe some of you know his work. I recommend his essays, Dancers, Buildings, and People in the Streets, which is a great text on how to look at things, how to just be awake and see and walk around in that state of awareness. And of course, Rudy Burkhart, whose son is here tonight, I first met, I think Ted took me to Red Grooms's loft, and Rudy was working on a film. I think these were elders who were very, very in tune in a way with the sort of the ethos and the activities at the Poetry Project, more so in a way than John Ashbery, who was a little more aloof and didn't go to readings in that way, or certainly Jimmy Schuyler was not going out very much to readings, and Barbara had another kind of life. And so they were really close and responsive and interactive, and their work was stunning always, and always, going into these other categories of performance and activity and collaboration. And I mean, Rudy was also a fantastic photographer, filmmaker, and painter. So that there's so many people to pay homage to who are great elders for us, teachers, mentors, without an official, way that you're in a classroom or that kind of situation. But we, in terms of the inner space of the architecture, we were definitely sitting at their feet and worshiping them. And then there was a dynamic going on. I think some of the painful things that went on was the 2-year grant was running out and things were changing. Joel Oppenheimer, who had been selected for the job of the director, was a printer, a poet, and very, deep connection to Black Mountain and that whole world of poetry. He and Paul Blackburn were kind of in different worlds, but more in the same poetic grouping, you could say. Paul was a wonderful translator of his book Proenza, of troubadour poetry is quite beautiful. There was a terrific event at the Poetry Project last year honoring his republishing of his work, and I mentioned his archive earlier. Then there was Carol Berger, a very feisty poet who I think really wanted to take over. So in a way, but somehow this younger group, we were really, most of us, the younger ones in our 20s, had a kind of energy and optimism, for want of a better word. I don't know, I can't remember what it was. But there was, a sense of a passing of that torch, that the metro so much in our minds is such a key spot. And Allen Ginsberg, in a terrific introduction to one of my anthologies, talks about the earlier, the prior kinds of communities and reading spaces in the West Village and the De Magot, also down near us, and just that tradition. And then, we were able to bring it into the project when there was a falling out with the metro. Their politics weren't working. It had to do with money and so on. Anyway, it was an auspicious move. And then we're, hippie world, Fillmore East, the artists, again, elders who were so connected, including Alex Katz, whose son is here tonight. I mean, I'm so happy that some of the younger generations continue whatever this spirit is, this ethos. George Schneeman, Joe Brainerd, also a writer, Donna Dennis, Martha Diamond, and then Philip Guston, and that was an interesting connection. Philip was going through this radical change in his painting. He was painting his these Ku Klux Klan-like figures. Maybe, do you know Philip Guston's work? Some of you check that out. And he was very interested in our poetry, the younger poets, and provided flyers and some covers for some of the small presses that were coming out of our scene, and including a cover for The World, which was the official poetry magazine. And, incredible gratitude to them also for that. Again, it was gift economy. There was no transaction like, we're going to buy a artwork of yours. And if anything, they would give you the work and tell you, if you need to sell it, please be our guest. We want you to survive, and we want your projects to survive. And then we were situated that second year on 2nd Avenue and 2nd Street, where the Anthology Film Archive is, and the earlier, what's it called, the Millennium Film Project had been there. So when the project officially started, it was money from the Office of Economic Opportunity for the Poetry Project, which had, poets had been meeting in the Parish Hall. For Theater Genesis, they had been going for about a year, doing plays by Sam Shepard and others, Murray Mednick. They had been, getting by. And then the film project, the Millennium Film Project. So 3 things were benefited by that first grant, but it was over after 2 years, and we were all kind of on our own. And had to seek, and I became director at, after the 2nd year, and it fell on me to, just keep it going, try to keep it going, which is interesting. It's never been a very good fundraiser. Okay, I'm going to jump to, I know we're running out of time. Clark Coolidge. This is in an anthology where I asked people to speak about their connection to the church. For me, St. Mark's was, among other values, the beginning of when everything began to exist again on tape, and everybody got a second chance at the sound. The feeling that every syllable, that grunt, scream, ever read or said or whispered in the interstices of the church continues to exist, and given several lifetimes, you could play it all back. This notion probably arises from the very fact that Larry Fagan and I spent a year once editing years of St. Mark's teachings, from cassettes to reel tapes. I may not have been to many of the readings, but I certainly heard most of them, thanks to all the various machines nobody in the place ever seemed to be exactly expert at. And then there was that podium amp that usually provided backfires of heavy metal accompaniment, and the later one that seemed to have a rock station aimed at it, and the ones that somebody forgot to turn on reverse the cassette to turn the cassette over, etc. The labyrinthian wiring of poetry. I love that term, the labyrinthian wiring of poetry. The color of its oxide tracings. Ted Berrigan stood in front of the Parish Hall mantelpiece the first time I walked in, spring of 1966. That's where we started our part of the discontinuous but endless conversation. Someday I must find that tape. Ted Berrigan came from Rhode Island, had been in Korea, had gone back to college on the GI Bill, and then come to New York, and he was from Tulsa, or had gone to school in Tulsa, and that's where he had met Ron Padgett and Dick Gallup and Maureen's partner. I can't remember his first name. But in any case, there was already this Tulsa, the also from the same book, and I'm call this section Right on, Vinny. Encouragement is like I'm reading at one of those huge St. Mark's New Year's benefit readings with hundreds of people in the audience. The 5 readers before me seem interminable. I'm so damn nervous. Finally, Bob Rosenthal is blurting something out about the throbbers, and I step up. Allen Ginsberg is smiling and saying, "Have a ball," as I trip lightly up. So I read this poem about Edwin Demby with tons of sentiment and emotion in it. I was sure it was the right thing to do, but it was a little weird in the days of blue window flux towards minute poetry, toward minute poetry. Then in a natural speaking voice, but somehow resonating across the whole room, I hear Ted say, "Right on, Vinny." He said it so calmly, but I heard it, and he knew I heard it. I stood there a moment shivering, then I walked off the stage. Poetry is tied to ritual and to breath, the sounding of the syllables. The actual making of the sounds is as important as how you work with your mind in silence. So ideally, in your own work, it's been described throughout history that the mind, when you're making the work, is not you there. You, that conglomeration of tendencies, is inside the work. You are rolling with it, and sometimes the experience is very synchronous. This is what really interests me in making art. What are those forms of mind which you can ride when you're not distracted and in monkey mind mode, or constantly returning to the ubiquitous watcher, when you are really seeing through the conditioned layers of existence and received ideas and habitual hopes and fears? What is that daily attention, daily practice that can envision being of use to others in your work, outside the structures and strictures of your own grasping ego? I mean, in being in touch with the patterns of your thinking and your body in the world, you're in touch with the mind of poets at all times, which are contemporaneous in you, the sense of being a container for so many realities. And that, gets clearer when you're working with others, I've always found. So St. Mark's had already had a long-standing relationship to the arts, opening its doors early in the Bohemian century to Isadora Duncan, William Carlos Williams, Harry Houdini, Frank Lloyd Wright, jazz musicians, many political groups, but the poets had been gathering at the Metro. So there was a move to the church parish hall, and the weekly open readings began, spearheaded by Paul. And that group included Diane, Carol, and so on. Sam Shepard's first plays were done upstairs, run by Ralph Cook. I knew Sam, I knew Charlie Mingus Jr., they were buddies. I was still in college on a work semester. I had a number of odd jobs, but already was on this amazing left-hand magical path of poetry. I'd been to the historical Berkeley Poetry Conference and had taken a vow to work with the outrider lineages of the new American poetry, the Beats, Black Mountain, New York School, San Francisco Renaissance. This was the most exciting writing going on, and it flourished in the small presses and in cafes and bars outside academic mainstream and white male angst. There was a lot of potential at the St. Mark's site. It was a seminal zone for a range of artists. I first saw Empire at St. Mark's in the church parish hall and some other Warhol films. An enterprising sociologist at the New School for Social Research named Harry Silverstein got a grant from that office under Lyndon Johnson. He would track the curriculum, do research, and interview a lot of the participants. So he set this tripartite situation up around the poets who were already there and the filmmakers and Theater Genesis. Then Dance Space came later. This was when Joel was hired. I was one of his assistants. We got money to start a modest library. I remember going with Joel to the 8th Street bookstore and buying a ton of poetry books that were dutifully stamped property of the Poetry Project, and then subsequently disappeared within a few months. I think my salary was about $6,000 a year, and then I became director. It was increased to $8,000. The poets were only paid $50 to read. Ted Berrigan got $5 to put up the chairs. So that grant lasted 2 years, and then we had to wake up and survive. So I have a list of what else was going on in our world. You had, the troops in Vietnam totaling 250,000 by 1966. Paint It Black came out, the Rolling Stones. There were huge anti-war demonstrations all over in March and April. First African-American appointee for presidential cabinet under LBJ, Robert Weaver for HUD. There were nuclear tests going on continuously at the Nevada test site. The first acid test events in San Francisco. Martin Luther King made his first speech against the Vietnam War. Civil rights activist James Meredith shot. The Miranda Act enforced. Police must inform suspects of their rights before questioning. There was Blonde on Blonde, Dylan, the International Organization of Women, now founded in D.C. Freedom of Information Act, signed by LBJ. Groundbreaking ceremonies for the World Trade Center. So-called race riots, incorrect term there, in Lansing, Michigan. House of Un-American Activities investigates Americans who have aided the Viet Cong. Transit workers strike shuts down New York City subways for 12 days. Cigarette smoking hazardous to health. Chelsea Girls opens, and Hitchcock's Rear Window. A U-2 plane disappears in Cuba. And Rivers and Mountains comes out in '66, Ashbery, Berrigan, Some Things. Some translations by Paul Blackburn, Creeley's poems 50 to 65, Robert Duncan, The Years as Catches, Leroy Jones's, later Amity Baraka's Black Art, James Merrill's Nights and Days, Sylvia Plath's Ariel, Kenneth Rexroth's shorter poems, Adrian Rich's Necessities of Life, and Sexton, Lewis Simpson, and Gary Snyder, a range of poems, and Louis Zukowski, all the collected short poems. I'm going to quickly do one last thing here, which is to go through this section called amusement. Amusement as an attitude, these are some New York school tropes. Be amused, be amusing of it, a word Frank O'Hara used a good deal as a kind of ethos, not sneering or cynical or ironical even, but a health stance, not taking it all too seriously. Kenneth Koch's playfulness comes to mind here. A poem was allowed to chronicle the history of its own making. The mind of the poet could also be the subject of the poem. Rather than an external theme played out with a beginning, middle, rise, and end, and often an epiphany, as with many traditional verse culture poems, the poems might meander and shift and turn and be a kind of serendipitous adventure, rarely a straight narrative line. There's a walking around poem form, a la Guillaume Apollinaire or Walt Whitman's Manhattan Streets I Sauntered Pondering. Open form, composition by field, originating from Stéphane Mallarmé's A Throw of the Dice. The parallel to indeterminacy in music and painting, which parallels the work and interests of radical Zen thinker and composer John Cage. Writing was an activity and continuous present, as mentioned before. Frank O'Hara was able to write with others around him that enter into the poem as he's composing it. And this was constantly going on at my apartment. Poetry was also seen as a collaboration with language. Language rather than logic led to certain moves. You weren't always at the controls. The language pushed on you. Free association, again, sound over logic. The language took you to strange, wild, funny, unpredictable places, not so much concerned with the final form, but an engagement with the medium of imagination itself, free of heavy mythological, historical reference, footnotes a la The Wasteland, though I think women had to re-examine this. So these are questions that I'm also sort of meditating on. And, you know, the work, say, of Alice Notley's Alette, the Bernadette's playing with the Catullus, you know, so these wild translations of Catullus, my own long feminist epic, the Ovius Trilogy, and actually, you know, drawing on other models like H.G., Helen in Egypt, and on seizing the epic, the long poem, as a form for, you know, this different kind of body. Let's just put it that way. So that's a very interesting conversation about gender and epic, the long poem, and so on. There's lots of work being done on that. And there are many, many examples of extraordinary. So, you know, there's no absolute ban on, you know, reference and mythology. We're bringing back mythology. That's what Alice always says. Irony, wit, humor, irreverence, puns, parodies, odd juxtapositions of tenses, pronouns, and point of view. Mistranslations, the notion of translating a poem from a language you do not understand. Collage, cut up, Tristan Tzara, or like William Burroughs. Ted Berrigan's sonnets are great examples of, you know, brilliant cut up and erasure methods. Many ad hoc forms, a river in every line, alphabet poems. There were certain key books that, as young second-generation New York schoolers, we were looking at. The book Hebdomerus by the painter Giorgio de Chirico, Motherwell's The Dada Painters and Poets, a book called Science and Sanity, which Burroughs had recommended and was a favorite of Ted's, written by Count Korzybski on semantics, really, which is a great book. Overheard Conversation, What People Are Saying, Cutting and Stealing Lines from Books, Appropriation, Scrambling Lines, Deleting Every Second Word, the Oulipo Strategies, Logic of Dreams, Let Sentences Stop and Start Like One's Attention, Instability of Meaning or Logic, Ambiguity in the relation between word and world or between word and concept was arbitrary, then one's attitude toward language had to change. And let's see, it was a quote from, "There's an invisible architecture often supporting the surface of the poem, interrupting the progress of the poem. It reaches into the poem in search for an identity with the poem. An architecture in the period before the poem finds an exact form and vocabulary, before the visible appearance of the poem on the page and the invisible approach to its composition. Reaching out to develop the poem, there are interruptions, some apparently for no reason. Something else is happening. The poet has no control. The poem begins to quiver, to hesitate, to become insubstantial. The desire of poetry to elevate itself, to become stronger. The poetry is fragile. It needs to reach through the armed vehicle of the poem to loosen the armed hand." Low rents in the Lower East Side, soon to be dubbed the East Village, were key in the early 60s to the sustenance of all of this, to maintain, how can we be artists? Louis and I were paying $110 at 33 St. Mark's Place. No one had real jobs. No one was going for PhDs then. Our field of study was the neighborhood and one another, and writing and reading the works of one another, as Ted called them. The workshops were just starting. We were taught, and they were taught by poets, uncredentialed poets. That the credential was that you were a practicing active poet with something you wanted to convey. You could critique with authority and generosity. So no big job interview, recommendations, et cetera. Decisions around these kinds of choices, I think, for the community were sort of intuitive. And there are, I've looked into little anthropological studies of, smaller cultures that there's a kind of intuitive agreement on somebody who should lead or somebody who should do this or that. And people have different roles within that sort of structure. So it always felt we were, working on some intuitive way. Affinities were running along more with second-generation New York school lines, especially as I moved in the position of director, and some of us had that grand experience of being in those workshops I mentioned. Many had their first teaching experience at the church, Bert Berrigan for one, and Bernadette Mayer, who spawned the language school in her workshop in the early 70s. And this was the whole evolving pedagogical wing of things and very central in this building of poetics and community. And the incident of Kenneth Koch during the Columbia University riots, where David Shapiro, a student of Kenneth's, was on the cover of Time magazine protesting the hideous investments of the school, the Vietnam War. Andre Codrescu and the guy who ran off with George Kimball's wife in a raincoat stalked Kenneth Koch, and this guy came down the aisle of St. Mark's Church. I was in the front row with a gun in his hand and with a trench coat, a real gun, but with blanks, and shot Kenneth as he was reading a poem called "To My Audience." And people remember it differently. I think there's a very good account in the Daniel Kane book, All Poets Welcome. But my memories, we stopped and I got Kenneth down to the corner bar and had, we had some drinks and then continued the reading later, but I can't. I was very young. That's all I can say. That's my excuse. Then, let's see. And I think his name was Alistair, I can't remember. Curation. I wish there was some clear documentation of this, and possibly there is in correspondence somewhere yet to be discovered. A kind of proto-advisory board evolved, and the sense was that poets had gathered like this, figuring out who would come read for $25, and then it became $50. We're coming from the Le Metro readings, that group of the deciders. It was this cohort of dedicated poet diehards. It was never about money or official job stature, et cetera, and it was an impressive group who mostly agreed, yet individually carried some strong poetic views. I was impressed by the loyalty of poetry community, always have been, in the sense that people knew one another's work. So somewhere we had this early curation meeting, which was an extension of the Metro Poets, and those most connected and regular to that reading series there. And I'd been to the Metro a few times, but it was called up by Joel. Joel decided to work with some of the people who had been sort of anxious about his getting the directorship job. He was a poet, printer on his second marriage, beautiful new child. He seemed to prefer the company of the journalists who wrote for the Village Voice. He also had a column there, all lowercase type. And Pete Hamill was a close friend. So my meetings with Joel, my boss, were always at the Lion's Head bar. That's where I would deliver his paycheck, and we'd have, I'd bring him mail, and we would, we'd have our meetings. This is part of the floating world motif. So the Voice crowd hung out at the Lion's Head. It was on Christopher. And this was where I could catch up with Joel and so on. No, there was no office with name and title on there. We had no office, really, at the church. On the committee, as I recall, was Joel Sloman, hired to assist Joel the first year, a poet from Boston who had been a student of Denise Levertoff's. And then I was an assistant dean secretary, although I didn't have any secretarial skills. I could not type. I had dropped out of my high school touch typing class. But I did love to organize and love the opportunity to be putting things together. So I was deemed secretary, and also on the committee were Rochelle Owens, George Economou, Diane Wachowski, and the fierce, scary Carol Berger. Joel was grateful, but I always think he was reluctant. He kind of eschewed being a leader, reluctant to be this decider. But I remember haggling with Diane Wachowski over the poetry of Edwin Demby. Demby, at one of these occasions, but Demby didn't even want to read. He never read in public, but he was a saint of the New York school. He wrote sonnets. Maybe that was too retro to her. No one else was that familiar with his writing, or maybe knew he had something to do with dance. And of course, as I said, Edwin never really wanted to read aloud, but his work was not even available. It was out of print then. But I was making the case for him just to talk about him as this important poet, and I was just getting to know him. But she did like Howard Elmsley's poetry, and then offered me that was a kind of the consolation prize for me, substitution for Edwin, and that seemed so odd. These poets were so very different, but they carried similar affiliation in her mind, so there was something of that difference of schools at play, at work. And then just a shout out to Paul, who lugged his Wallensack, the heaviest reel-to-reel in town. Sam Abrams, who worked at the church for a while, has a great little anecdotes about having to carry it for him. And it was called, the biggest schlep in town was carrying this Wallensack recorder. Now you can just do it on your telephone. Gift economy. How can I ever express enough, and with choirs of angels and bodhisattvas, the importance, the necessity of divine community, ongoing community? As I've often said, I'm still in the room with so many who were there, still here, and hold lineage and memory of a different time, the foundation years, the infrastructure of community, if you will, the sacred conversation, poetry and gossip and tricks of the trade, who's in, who's out, what was up in the galleries, what to see, what's on, what else is going on. And we constantly were visiting each other back then in the home, bringing new poems, at the ready for collaboration with George Schneeman or Joe Brainerd, or calling on them to do a flyer for a reading. Any hour of the night or day, the Schneeman store always open to me, the poker games, the posing for portraits, the delicate, delicious, simple meals, the atmosphere of Italy, the feeling that people had your back, and that you could ask for something without it being a financial transaction. Philip Guston had come into our lives with extraordinary generosity, and he said, sell this drawing if you have to keep the stuff going, and I had to. I remember carrying up this beautiful oversized drawing for the World 29, this gorgeous Guston work, which always made me think of the crash of 1929, and the drawing with its garbage can of comic detritus and human legs and apocalyptic intensity. And I took it to the David McKee gallery, that was his gallery, and weeping when I said I needed to sell it, but wouldn't David rather buy the ring I was wearing or something else valuable I could more easily part with? He calmed me down and said, think it over, it wasn't time. I carried that large drawing back. At least I'd had the perspicacity to frame it. I carried it back home and put it on its hook and apologized to it as if I might be betraying an old friend. I think I'll just close with two things. This is a quote I've liked and have been reading recently from, it's a book called The Forests, Pogue Harrison. The scale of transformations we are witnessing today has no precedent either in natural or cultural history. The global uprooting of both nature and humanity make each and every one of us a refugee of sorts. How long we remain refugees on the earth, no one can say, but the fact of homelessness has now become obvious even to the most privileged or protected members of the human family. What is not obvious to us, on the other hand, are the potential saving forces that one day may rise up against the tide of nihilism. It may be well that in the future, these decades will be remembered above all for the improbable existence of a handful of poets who brought the old household gods into hiding. From our present perspective, nothing seems more superfluous to the contemporary turbulence of history than poets. Yet our present perspective may turn out to be the most superfluous thing of all. This much is certain, at a time when the gods have no choice but to flee from the falling city of man. It is only the poets who can take them into their safekeeping. And one last little memory from Ed Friedman, who later ran the poetry project for about 17 years. So after Ron Padgett served, Bernadette Mayer, Maureen Owen, Patricia Spears Jones, both Maureen and Patricia were the second directors, and others, Stacy Samazic, now they're doing a great job, Anselm Berrigan. And this is a memory from Ed Friedman. Then Anne came to open the church. We were going to start the Gertrude Stein Marathon together. I was still shaky inside from kissing Bernadette, and extra shaky around Anne, who I also had a crush on. Anne said, "Go ahead and start. I have to go upstairs for a minute." So I sat down at a table in the middle of the church and began reading Lifting Belly from my copy of Bee Time Vine. I have been heavy and had much selecting. I saw a star which was low. It was so low it twinkled. Breath was it. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder, Anne's, and it was beautiful in the church, dark except for the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Fire. And we were reading, trading lines back and forth. Anne, I am with her. Ed, lifting belly to me. Anne, very nicely done. Ed, poetry is very nicely done. Thank you.